Welcome back to Hudson Appliance for another episode of Wicked Good Food. Our plan for today is to utilize this piece of meat. I got this at the supermarket. This is top round and it's sold as a roast. But what we're going to do is we're going to take it, which it's not the best roast in the world. It comes from actually the thigh of the cow, which is a muscle that gets used a lot. Because it gets used a lot, it's not super tender. But we're going to use it in 3 different applications and we're going to make it fantastic. One of them is we're going to make a country fried steak or a chicken fried steak. And we're going to make a nice black pepper cream gravy to go with it. We're also going to make an Asian inspired pepper steak. So we're going to use some cracked black pepper in that with some peppers and onions and saute that. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to make an awesome steak and cheese sandwich with a little bit of fresh mozzarella cheese, some fresh basil, and some tomatoes. So I'm going to get going by breaking this down a little bit. I'm going to use my boning knife, which I ran over my steel a little bit just to make sure it's nice and sharp. And all I want to do is I want to remove first the piece of string, because we're not going to eat the string today, hopefully. And if you see on here, you can see this silver skin. It's kind of shiny. We want to remove that. That's the stuff that you end up chewing up and spitting out because you can't chew it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick my knife right under it, just like so. And I'm going to angle my knife up. This stuff is pretty tough. And I want to just, without removing too much of the meat, remove our silver skin. So I'm going to keep going down. Now this doesn't need to be trimmed all that much. It's mostly meat. And you can tell by looking at it, there's lots of red. There's a little piece here we're going to have to trim off. So we'll go ahead and trim this as well. And then there's this seam right in between here. So there's actually 2 different muscles. So what we're going to do is just use the tip of our knife. Let's do that and make little cuts right down. And you can open it up after you make each little cut. Now you can see why I wanted a really sharp knife to get going here. All right. So now this hunk here, this is going to be perfect for our steak and cheese. This is what we're going to use for that. What we're going to do to make it a little bit easier to cut, we're actually going to freeze this. We're not going to freeze it so it's solid, but we're going to throw it in the freezer for a little while. And just enough to get it firm. So I'm going to remove some more silver skin, a little bit of the fat here. And do the same over here. Now like I said, this is not a super tender piece of meat, which means it's inexpensive, which is great. It's a great alternative. And you will never know that this is not a piece of meat, tender piece of meat by the time we're done with it. All right, so I'm going to take this, stick it in the freezer in a moment. Now this hunk here, this is pretty clean. There's a little more skin here, so we'll remove that. Now for our other 2 dishes, we're going to make our pepper steak. So for our pepper steak, I'm going to cut this right in half. I want relatively small pieces. Oh, here's some more silver skin I need to trim off. All right. Now, if you can see on this piece of meat, there's a grain. Just like a piece of wood, there's a natural grain that runs through a piece of meat. So in this one, it's running this way. What I want to do is I want to cut perpendicular to that. I want to cut the opposite way. And what that's going to do is it's going to break the grain down, which is going to make this more tender. So now I'm going to switch over to my chef's knife. And I'm going to slice it really thin, right across the grain like that. And do it as thin as you want. And this is another application too, where if you want, you could throw this in the freezer. But once again, with a nice sharp knife, we'll go right through. Move that out of the way. Yeah, just about done. Now I'm going to take this, and what I want to do is I actually want to marinate this in just soy sauce. It's going to be a quick marinade. It's only going to be as long as it takes for us to get all our other things done. So I'm going to stick that in there. Now the last thing we're going to do our beef for is for our chicken fried steak or our country fried steak. Now I'm going to look at this and I'm going to look where the grain is. The grain is kind of running this way here. So I'm going to cut across that grain. And for this I want a larger piece of meat. You could not trim that. You could use a piece that's that big and have a piece that fills your whole plate if you want. But for this we're going to do some strips. So I'm going to cut once again across the grain. And I'm going to cut a little bit thicker than I had been. And I'll show you why in a minute. So once again, everything we're doing here is trying to get this beef, this inexpensive cut of beef, to be more tender. All right, so our scraps can go aside. Those can get put into a broth or a stock if you're going to make it. They can get trimmed out a little more if you need it, and I'm not going to use this last little bit. Now, the last thing we're going to do to this to make it more tender is we're going to pound it out. So I'm going to lay some of these strips of steak out. And I have a piece of plastic right here. I'm going to put this on top of the steak, like so. And the only reason I'm doing that is so that it doesn't splatter all over the place and we cross-contaminate everything. I'm going to grab our mallet. Now on our mallet, there's one side that has little spikes. There's another side that's flat. For this, we're going to use the little spikes because we really want to beat this up. We want to get this as tender as we can. If I were going to pound out a chicken breast or something like that, I don't want to actually dig into the meat as much. I would use the flatter side. But I'm going to go ahead and check it out. Now it's nice and thin. You can see where it leaves marks in there. I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing. Now it's very thin, it's going to cook really quickly. All right, I'm going to go ahead, pound the rest of this out, get this meat into the freezer, and I'm going to marinate this in soy sauce. When we come back, we're going to go ahead and start making our gravy for our steak sandwiches. All right, so just before we went away, I got a little excited about and I said sandwiches for our chicken fried steak, which does make an incredibly good sandwich. But that's not what we're going to make today because we have another sandwich. I wanted to show you, I finished pounding out the beef. One thing you want to think about is think about the size of the pan that you're going to cook this in. So these pieces were relatively large. I wanted to check and make sure they fit. We're going to cook them right in this cast iron skillet here. If they were too large, not the end of the world, you just cut them in half. So I'm going to move those out of the way for now. These are our pieces of beef for our pepper steak. I marinated that in just some soy sauce, some lower sodium soy sauce. It still is very, very salty, but we don't need all the extra salt of full strength soy sauce. So we're going to start making our sausage gravy now. And what I have here is just a regular pork sausage. This is about 1/3 of a pound. I'm going to put it into our pan, which I preheated a little bit. And we're going to let this cook for a few minutes and get totally brown. Now, depending on which brand of pork sausage you use, you're going to end up with more or less fat in the bottom of your pan. And we want the fat, because what we're going to do is we're going to thicken this by adding some flour to it and making our roux. Let me turn the heat up a little bit here. So I'm going to spread this out just a little bit. Now, the first time I ever had this, it blew my mind. I was on an internship working down at DFW Airport in Dallas, Texas. And I walked into this restaurant that I was about to start working in. So I ordered a CFS, which is a chicken fried steak, which still didn't make any sense because it had no chicken in it. But it's because it's fried just like chicken is. And it was awesome. It came with this white gravy that had big chunks of pork and big chunks of peppercorns in it. And so that's what we're going to recreate for you today. While that's beginning to brown, I'm going to go ahead and start to cut our tomatoes for our sandwich. So I have Roma tomatoes. I'm going to cut them in half, the long way. Let me move this out of your way. And just remove the core. And we'll take, we'll do 3 of them, I guess. Once again, a really sharp knife makes a huge difference. Now, I'm a little bit of a texture guy. I don't like tomato seeds, so I'm going to remove the seeds out of these tomatoes. Now, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can take and make what they call a supreme of tomato, where you cut right along like this, and you remove all that. You can do this on a peeled tomato too, and you have just the flesh of the tomato. I'm not worried about that much. I'm just going to take my fingers, stick them in there, pop the seeds out. So as we go to cook our steak for our steak and cheese, I'm going to throw these right on the griddle as well, because I want these to cook a little bit. I like cooked tomatoes more than fresh tomatoes, especially going on a hot sandwich. So we're going to add a little bit of sugar and a little bit of salt to these and let them caramelize a little bit. All right. Oh, the other thing I forgot to say is I put our beef for our steak and cheese in the freezer, just so I can show you how it slices a little differently when it's frozen. Now, once again, all these tomato scraps, these will be awesome to throw into that stock you're going to make with your leftover beef. All right, so these can just get moved out of the way. I'm going to come back and take a peek here. All right, good. We're starting to get a little browning. I'm going to turn this up even more now. And remember, brown is flavor. The more brown something is, the more flavor it's going to have. Once it turns black, that's a different story. It's going to get bitter on you. But we want to get brown. If there's a little bit of brown stuck to our pan, that's fine too. We're going to add some liquid to this, and it's going to remove that. All right, taking a look at what I'm seeing here, we're going to need to add some more fat to this. So I have about half a stick of butter. We'll go ahead and put that right in there. Nice. This smells awesome. Too bad you can't smell. So we have our largest studio audience today that we've had so far. There's some members of the Chef Matt Williams Wicked Good fan club that even had t-shirts made up. We might have to show you some of those later on. So they can smell it and they can taste it. So if you want to come and be part of the studio audience sometime, go ahead and give a call or shoot an email to Donna at Hudson Appliance, and she can make all the arrangements and make sure there's enough seats for you. All right, now we see a good amount of liquid in there. I want this to brown up just a little bit more. Now, while that's going to finish browning, I'm going to go ahead and turn on this cast iron skillet and add some oil to it. So we're going to fry our chicken fried steak or our country fried steak right in this pan here. The best thing to use for this is lard. Lard rules. And unfortunately, it's gotten a really bad rap, and they're finding out that it's not as bad as everyone once said it is. But we're going to use some vegetable oil today because I couldn't find lard at the market. Now I only want enough fat to come just about to the top of the beef. Once it cooks halfway, we're going to flip it over and let it finish cooking. Now remember, our beef is very, very thin. So we don't need to have an awful lot of oil, and it doesn't have to cook very long. All right, this is exactly where I want it. So now we're going to go ahead and add our flour to this. One thing that's really important about adding our flour is that, remember, our temperature is relatively high. We need to cool this down, because we don't want our flour to burn on the edges of the pan before it gets a chance to cook. The reason we add the flour and cook it is so that when we actually add our liquid to it, we get a nice smooth consistency. If we were to just throw flour in there, we'd end up with a lumpy mess. So that looks good. Now I'm going to kind of do this by eye. And what I'm looking for is I'm looking to absorb all the fat. So our pan should be relatively dry, but it shouldn't be super dry. Yeah, that's just about perfect. You shouldn't have any flour hanging out on the edges of your pan after this gets a chance to cook. All right, I'm going to give this a couple minutes to let our roux cook. We'll let our oil heat up. We're going to set up a breading station, and when we come back, we're going to go ahead and fry our chicken fried steak and get ready to do our other two steak dishes. So this had a chance to brown now. Our oil's starting to warm up. Now I've switched over to a whisk. Now at this point in the cooking, this is actually the most important time. This is when we're going to add our cold liquid to our hot roux. When we add this, you need to make sure that all of the roux that you just made dissolves before it warms up. Otherwise, you'll get little roux balls again. And like I said before, nobody likes little roux balls bouncing around their mouth.